Thank you all very, very much for being here this evening. I want to thank the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews for the invitation to speak this evening, in particular Dr. Eva Derman and Pavla Niklova for their behind-the-scenes work to put this event together this evening. And Dr. Derman, I'm going to give you your water back. I'd also like to thank tonight's co-sponsors, the American Society for Jewish Music's Jewish Music Forum, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, and the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association. And also thank you to George in the booth. Thank you, George. It is especially a pleasure to speak tonight for the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews because my wife's family has ties to the village of Kolbasov in Czechoslovakia. So I thank you very much for the invitation this evening. I'd like to begin with a story. Once upon a time, there lived a boy named Tzvi Elimelech Shapira. Tzvi Elimelech's mother was the niece of the famous Rabbi, Reb Elimelech of Lezhensk, and his father was a Talmud Chacham and an itinerant teacher of Torah. As a young boy, Tzvi Elimelech was exceptionally bright. He was curious, and he wanted to understand his own spiritual roots. Now, I should clarify here that when many of us talk about exploring our roots, we mean taking a 23andMe test. This was not what Tzvi Elimelech wanted. Steeped in a world that took seriously the idea that every person has a soul that itself has a genealogy, he longed to understand the essence of who he was by understanding his own spiritual root. These questions bubbled up for him in a particularly potent way every Hanukkah, when he felt a significant increase in the level of holiness that permeated the air. But he couldn't understand this. It could not be the case that he was a descendant of the Chashmonaim, the Hasmoneans of the Hanukkah story, because unlike them, he was not a Kohen, a member of the priestly class. So, to help him figure this out, he decided to pay a visit to his teacher, the seer of Lublin, so-called because using Ruach HaKodesh, a Holy Spirit that enables one to see metaphysical reality, he could perceive the essence of one's soul. Tzvi Elimelech entered the seer of Lublin's home, but before he could even say a word, the seer announced, "You are from the tribe of Yisachar. You sense the extra holiness of Hanukkah because you are a member of the rabbinical court of the Chashmonaim." Later, Tzvi Elimelech would author a commentary on the Torah that is permeated by mystical thought. He called the book the Bnei Yisachar, drawing on the verse from the book of Chronicles, Umi Bnei Yisachar Yodei Bina. Like many Hasidic rabbis, he would become known by the name of his book. And today there are a great many stories about the holiness and the wisdom of the Bnei Yisachar. We'll come back to this. The Bnei Yisachar settled in the town of Dinov, Poland, but his influence spread widely. By the first decades of the 20th centuries, his followers in the Dinov Hasidic dynasty, as it became known, had set up synagogues in the Czech lands, with a presence in the Uzhhorod area. Importantly, his grandson, Rabbi Shlomo Spira, settled in the town of Munkach in Subcarpathian Rus, where he established the famous Munkacher dynasty. Among the stories told about the Bnei Yisachar is one tale that highlights beautifully the emphasis that he placed on music. I should say from the start that I don't know if this story is true. I came across it on the internet some years ago, and it stuck with me, even though I do have some questions about it. Nonetheless, I think that it provides a sense of the value of music in the circle of the Bnei Yisachar, even if we can't verify the details. The version of the story with which I'm familiar was recorded by a contemporary author and teacher named Yehoshua Rubin, and I'll make a condensed version of the story here. The story goes that a young Jewish boy named David had the good fortune of growing up attending the synagogue of the Bnei Yisachar. David had befriended a young boy named Carl, who was not Jewish. At the time, this was a bit unusual. While the relationship between Jews and non-Jews was better than in many other places, friendships were still uncommon. One day, the boys began to talk about their songs. Carl sang one of the songs that he had learned at church for David, and David was impressed by the beauty of the tune. When it was David's turn to teach a song, Carl stopped him. "David, I already know your songs," he said. David was taken aback. "How is that possible?" Carl explained, "Your synagogue is near our fields. Every Saturday morning, we're pulling potatoes from the ground, and we listen to your songs as we work." Sometime later, Carl had finished his work in the field and happened to be near the synagogue's doors on a Saturday as people left after the morning services. David exited and saw Carl. Carl smiled and asked him to come play. "Sure," David said, "but first I want to introduce you to the Rabbi." David took Carl to the Bnei Yissaschar, who warmly greeted Carl. In the following weeks, Carl made a point of being present to wave to the Bnei Yissaschar, who always smiled warmly to him. Time passed, and in 1841, the Bnei Yissaschar passed away. The news rippled through the whole town and rattled the Jewish community to its core. That Shabbos, David sat in the synagogue, wondering how he could pray without the Rebbe's beautiful voice to latch onto as it filled the air. Meanwhile, Carl was in the field, knowing that his friend's community had lost their leader. Instead of the beautiful sound of the Rebbe's voice filling the air, Carl heard nothing. So Carl started to sing. Ilu finu male shir kayam, where our mouths filled with songs like the ocean. Ulshonenu rina kamon galav, where our tongues alive with exultation like the waters. Enu anachnu masbikim lo'odos lecha, we would never have sufficient praise for you. Before Carl knew it, all of the workers in the field were singing the song, filling the void left by the Rebbe, who always sang those words aloud. Back inside the synagogue, the Jews wept. "Remember the teaching of our Rebbe," someone said. "Song possesses the holiness to break down all barriers between us and God, and even the walls between us and our neighbors." Is the story true? I don't know. But what we do know is that the Bnei Yissaschar, like many Jewish thinkers, placed a great emphasis on the spiritual power of music, and in fact composed music himself. I'd like to share with you one of the pieces that he composed that perhaps could have been sung in the Dinov synagogues that were established in the Czech lands on the High Holy Days. This melody was composed by the Bnei Yissaschar for the words V'chol Ma'aminim, which come from the High Holiday Liturgy. Bear with me 1 second.
Bum 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 ba ba bum 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 ba ba bum 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 ba di 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 da dum bum bum ba di 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 da dum bum bum ba di 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 da da dim bum I am pitam bum 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 ba bum bum I am ba bum bum Ba-di-di-di-da-dum bum bum. Ba-bi-di-di-da-dum bum bum. Ba-bi-di-di-da-dum bum bum. Be-a-dum be-ba-bum bum.
For many, music has been a tool of transcendence that is an essential ingredient in the spiritual tasks of a Jew. This evening, I'd like to explore music in the thought of some of the great rabbis of the Czech lands, and if time permits, to move beyond to share a particularly beautiful teaching from a bit further afield geographically. Along the way, we'll hear some music associated with the individuals we are discussing. Before progressing, it's worth it to step back for just a moment and say a few things about the topic of Jewish mysticism. The truth is that I don't love the phrase Jewish mysticism. Ashkenazi Jews in Europe lived a life that was through and through concerned with things that could not be seen, heard, or explained in any immediately pragmatic kind of way. For some, communicating with the dead was a common activity. Amulets and incantations were employed to help with all sorts of challenges that one faced in life. And indeed, in many cases, this was not dissimilar to certain practices of their non-Jewish neighbors. Nonetheless, it is certainly true that Jewish religious texts have long had a strand that is concerned with the inner workings of the way that God runs the world, and with peeling back the curtain that separates that which we can perceive from that which we cannot. And these are the texts that we'll be dealing with today. I want to note here that the ways the Jews have historically dealt in mysticism is highly gendered. In the Orthodox tradition from which the source material for today's presentation emerged, rabbinic texts are generally a male domain, while other practices that concerned healing or communicating with the deceased were largely female-dominated. Furthermore, in this community, public-facing music making itself was primarily and has primarily been a primarily male activity, though women do make music for other women. So I want to note that while the texts and music that we'll be examining are coming out of a male-coded domain, there have been other mystical practices that are associated with women as well. Though early sources in Jewish mysticism certainly exist, much of the literature is based deeply on the Zohar, a text traditionally attributed to the 2nd century Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, though contemporary Jewish studies scholars have offered alternative authorships and datings, most popularly that it was written by Moshe de Leon of 13th century Spain. The Zohar's esoteric explanations of the cosmos inspired great religious creativity, including among Jews in the Czech lands. Among the most famous figures in this intellectual lineage was the Maharal of Prague. The Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, has become a legendary figure with many stories surrounding his life, so many, in fact, that it's difficult to parse fact and fiction. For example, there's the story that tells us that his birth stopped a blood libel. As the story goes, a non-Jewish man had devised a plan to frame the Jewish community of using the blood of non-Jewish babies to make matzah for Passover. When the Maharal's mother went into labor, his household went running to find the midwife. The con man, who was carrying a blood-soaked bag, thought that they were chasing him, and he fled the scene and was thus unable to go through with his plan. But, of course, the Maharal is best known as the great rabbi who is said to have created a golem to protect the Jewish people. As a master of the Jewish mystical literature, he knew the secret formulas to bring this figure to life at a time of great need. While it's difficult to get to know the real Maharal through these stories, it is possible to do so instead through his own writings. The Maharal wrote many works which are still studied today, such as the Gur Aryeh, which is a commentary on Rashi's commentary on the Torah, the Be'er HaGola, which is a commentary on the esoteric teachings of the esoteric stories, I should say, of the Talmud, and many others. One of the features that characterizes the writings of the Maharal is that he was deeply unsettled in a non-messianic age. He longed for the messianic era and believed that being in the diaspora was an unnatural state for the Jews. He wrote a great deal about the Messiah, and through this we get a sense of his understanding of music, which comes up several times in his writing. Let's try now to understand one of his teachings, which is found in his text, the Netzach Yisrael. In this discussion, he explains that music represents a state of perfection, and we can see this in the musical instruments that are used to praise God. So we need a bit of background first. First, to get into the teaching, let's see 3 different types of stringed instruments that were found in canonical Jewish texts. First, we're going to look at something from the Talmud. This is Tractate Arachin, page 13b. We're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda here has an opinion. Let's see what he says about this harp. The harp used in the temple was an instrument of 7 strings. As it is stated, in your presence is fullness, which is sova, of joy. In your right hand, sweetness forevermore. But Rabbi Yehuda says, do not read the word as fullness, sova, but as 7, sheva. This indicates that the sweet harp played in the presence of God had 7 strings. And if you look, I have a pointer here, that sheva and sova look very similar to each other. So he's saying that that's actually what the intention is, that this is a 7-stringed instrument. Okay, so far we have one instrument that is a 7-stringed instrument that was played in the temple. Here's another one. This is from the book of Psalms, Psalm 6, the first line, Lamanatseach beniginot al hashminit mismor leDavid. Al hashminit is left untranslated here, but it has in it the word shmone, which is the number 8. So far we have a 7-stringed instrument, we have an 8-stringed instrument, and let's see one more. Psalm 33 is going to say, Rananu tzadikim b'Hashem la'yesharim navas tehila, hodel Hashem b'chinor b'nevel asor zamru lo. Praise the Lord with the lyre, with the 10-stringed harp, sing to him, which asor has in it, right here, has the word eser, which is 10. So far we have 3 different types of stringed instruments, one with 7 strings, one with 8 strings, and one with 10 strings. But the question is, okay, so why do we need all these different kinds of instruments? What's going on with all of this? Okay, so the Maharal is going to explain it to us in just a moment. But first we need one more passage. This again, we're going to look at the Talmud. This is the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Brachot. Here we're going to have a discussion about different periods in eschatological time, different periods in the long arc of history of the world. We're going to see, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, all the prophets only prophesied with regard to the change in world order in the end of days with regard to the days of the Messiah. However, with regard to the world to come, which exists on a higher level, it is stated, no eye has seen it, God, aside from you. So let's pause for a second. What he's saying is essentially we have 3 periods in time. We have our current period, we have the time of the Messiah, and then we have a time referred to as the world to come. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the prophets even could only have visions about the time of the Messiah, which is similar enough to our period, but the world to come is something completely different. But you see that the time of the Messiah itself is already significantly different from what we have. So we have 3 very distinct periods of time that are, in terms of their spiritual character, are going to be very distinct from one another. Okay, now there's a statement that is going to argue with this a little bit, as the Gemara likes to do. The Gemara notes that this statement disagrees with another statement from the opinion of Shmuel. Shmuel said, the only difference between this world and the days of the Messiah is with regard to servitude to foreign kingdoms. While in the days of the Messiah, Israel will be independent and free from enslavement to foreign powers, the world order will remain otherwise unchanged. As it is said, for the poor shall not cease from the land. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel is disagreeing. He's saying, really, this period and the time of the Messiah, not that different from each other. The only difference is that the Jewish people won't be enslaved to any other group of people. Other than that, fundamentally, in terms of its spiritual makeup, it's the same. The time to come, though, the world to come, that's a different thing. That's going to be a completely different character. Okay. Now that we understand that debate and we understand the 3 types of musical instruments, let's see the Maharal. The Maharal is going to connect this passage that we have here with the types of musical instruments using concepts in Jewish numerology. He explains that the different types of instruments are representative of different eras in the arc of time. So there's much more going on here than just talking about different instruments. These instruments are spelling out for us what the arc of time is going to look like. And this makes sense because for the Maharal, he says, quote, "It is the way of perfection to sing and make music." So it makes sense that as we look toward an increasingly perfect world, musical instruments that are capable of making this music that is going to represent the different time periods, perhaps to greater degrees because of the increasing number of strings, will be the physical representation of the changes in historical periods. So he says that the instrument with 7 strings is representative of the present world. Why? Because 7 is always the way of nature, which is why 1 week is 7 days, continuous, 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 over and over again. This is the way of nature. 8 strings, however, represents the Messianic age. Why? Because 8 is perfection beyond that which is known in this world. 8 is one step up from this. And I'll just emphasize this. This is why, for example, Hanukkah, as the mystics say, is 8 days long. Hanukkah is connected to Shemen. Shemen is the same root as Shmona, which is 8. So all of these are representative of being one level beyond that which is natural in this world. 10 strings is representative of the world to come. 10 equals total perfection. And this is represented by the 10 sfirot, the mystical emanations of God. So 10 is absolute completion at this time. So for the Maharal, musical instruments were more than just entertainment, certainly, and they were even more than just tools to sing to God. They were actual representations of how the entirety of human history is going to play out. Now, the idea that music is tied to the Messianic age is a common one, but it's not just the Messianic age. There's a common theme in Jewish discourse about music that music can attach one to a higher level of existence in the here and now. It's for this reason that many important rabbis have gone out of their way to sing music, and even in some cases, to compose music. One example of such a composer is Rabbi Moses Sofer. Come back to this in a bit. Also known as Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, also known as the Chatam or Chassam Sofer, after the title of his work, Chidushe Torah of Moses Sofer, which is how you get Chatam Sofer, which in Ashkenazi pronunciation would be Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and was recognized as a child prodigy in Torah study. By the age of 12, he was studying with Rabbi Nathan Adler, a well-known Kabbalist, who was said to be a miracle worker. The Chassam Sofer also studied with Rabbi Pinchas Horowitz, known as the Baal Hafla'ah, who was a student of the Mezitor Magid, the primary disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, and was known to be a major authority in Jewish law. I'll digress for just a second, because we're focusing on the Czech lands, to tell you a story about Rabbi Pinchas Horowitz and another very important rabbi in Czech Jewish history, the great halachist Rabbi Shabtai HaKohen, known as the Shach, who held several important rabbinic positions in Moravia. The story goes that one day a butcher came to Rabbi Horowitz because he was unsure if an ox that he had slaughtered was kosher. There was some sort of possible defect found in the lung of the cow, which might render it unkosher. But this was a tough case. Rabbi Horowitz spent hours reviewing the halachic literature on this topic, some of which would suggest that the ox was not kosher. However, after a long time, he announced that the animal is in fact kosher and may be eaten. One of his students, who had been watching this whole episode, came over to him and said, "Rebbe, how did you decide it's kosher? The Shach clearly writes that in such a case, the animal is not kosher. How did you go against his ruling?" Rabbi Horowitz replied, "One day, I will have to stand before the heavenly court and account for every decision I made, including this one. The prosecutor will surely call the Shach, who will present a case against my decision. I will show that there are enough reasons based on minority opinions for me to feel comfortable saying that it's kosher. I am indeed very concerned about this, and I don't make the decision lightly. But if I had said that it's not kosher, when the time comes, I would have to answer to another witness. The ox. The ox will say that he could have fed so many hungry Jews. I could have provided so much energy for so much Torah learning. There was reason to say that I was kosher, but you denied me that opportunity? I decided that I'd rather face the shach than the ox in court. Anyway, after taking a few different rabbinical positions, the Chassam Sofer moved to Pressburg, now Bratislava. He would go on to be a very highly respected rabbi there. Sometime around 1803 to 1806, he established the Pressburg Yeshiva, which would soon become the largest and one of the most prestigious yeshivas in all of Central Europe. The Chassam Sofer was establishing this yeshiva at the same time that the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, was in full swing, and the Reform movement was becoming established. People looked to the Chassam Sofer to fight against the reformers, and fight he did. He published many responsa against the innovations of the Reform movement and advocated an approach that doubled down on tradition. Interesting for our purposes, he specifically argued against the use of the organ in synagogues, which was one of the hallmarks of the Reform movement. Importantly, in a 2002 article, contemporary author Aaron Schreiber closely analyzes the Chassam Sofer's writings and those of his immediate circles and argues that the Chassam Sofer was not opposed to secular knowledge. He was actually quite knowledgeable about mathematics and philosophy, but he warned his students that becoming too involved in these areas of knowledge would lead them away from Torah learning. We can imagine then that the Chassam Sofer was a very busy man as the leader of the largest yeshiva in Europe. But as a deeply religious Jew trained by one of the most important Kabbalists of his generation, very interestingly, he made time for music. It is said that he composed his own music, and his poetry was recorded in a book titled Shirei Moshe, which is available now. Songs have been passed down through his family until the present day. It's recorded in the book Nachle Bina that someone asked the Chassam Sofer's son when he found the time to compose music. The son, who is known as the Kasav Sofer, said that in the days following Yom Kippur and leading into Sukkot, his father was so overcome by feelings of love toward God that he had trouble focusing on Torah study. He would write songs to express this intense devotion. One such song is based on a line that the Chassam Sofer penned. In addition to being the lyrics of a song, he included it as the final line of his will. Here we have it in his writing, and I'll zoom in so you can see it here. The song states here, "May it be your will, God who gives the Torah, to not dry up the spring, nor should the tree be cut down, the fruit of the tree of life eternally. Amen." This is a short prayer that he included, that his continued generations would not cease the Jewish religious legacy that was in his family, and that the tree, that lineage, would not be cut down, that the spring would not dry up, that it would continue into the future. The song he turned this into a song, this line, which we'll hear a clip of right now. I won't play the whole thing; it's a bit long, but we'll get a sense of it. Stop it here, just for time. I want to share with you one more teaching about the importance of music according to Jewish mystical thought. To do so, with your permission, I'm going to move outside of the Czech lands and into Ukraine so that we can look at the views of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov having to do with music. Whoops, there we go. I turned to Rabbi Nachman because music was absolutely central to his mystical worldview. We'll be looking at his famous teaching known as the Azamra, which translates to I will sing. And I want to stress that we're just going to be scratching the surface of this teaching right now. There's a great deal of material online if you want to go further into it. We'll just be touching on it to give a sense of what music meant to him, but I assure you, we're really only scratching the surface. There's much, much, much to be said. Perhaps another time we'll have the opportunity to go deeper into Rabbi Nachman's view on music. So we're looking at chapter 282 of his magnum opus, Likutei Moharan, which actually was not written by him. It was written by his primary disciple based on the teachings that he delivered orally. Rabbi Nachman himself never actually wrote anything down, but he taught all of this material that was then recorded. And from what I understand, he edited a great deal of it. Okay. The launching point for our discussion is an instruction in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, that we must judge everyone favorably. Let's take a look at what he says. No, a person must judge everyone favorably. Even someone who is completely wicked, it is necessary to search and find in him some modicum of good, that in that little bit, he is not wicked. And by finding in him a modicum of good and judging him favorably, one genuinely elevates him to the scale of merit and can bring him to repent. Likewise, a person must find some good point within himself. He says just a bit further on. Likewise, he must go on searching until he finds himself yet another good thing. And although this good thing too is mixed with much impurity, still he must extract some good point from there as well. Indeed, he must go on searching and gathering further good points. Now, he's using this phrase, good points, very deliberately. What he uses in Hebrew, the phrase that you see here on the bottom line is nikudot tovot. Nikudot tovot can be good points, but he's also using it in another way. Nikudot, nikuda is the singular, the point can also refer to a musical note. So he's saying here that you have to find these good points, and he's going to pivot and show us that he also means musical notes. Let's see. He says a bit further down, and it is through this that melodies are made, this being finding good points in other people. As explained elsewhere, the aspect of playing a musical instrument is the aspect of gathering the good ruach, the good wind, from the wind, the ruach of gloom, depression. See there. The principle is that music of holiness is extremely lofty, as is known. In essence, music is made through the separation of good from evil. By selecting and gathering the good points from the bad, melodies and songs are created. Study there well. Let's see if we can explain just a bit of what he says, then I'll go a little further. He's saying that just as the act of finding a good point in a person and extracting it from all of the bad within that person, and also the same thing within yourself, finding good within yourself and extracting it from any not so good stuff that we have inside ourselves. He says that is literally the same act as taking from all the frequencies that are around us, and the way he sees it is pulling out the good frequencies, the good notes, from the other frequencies that are around it. Pulling out the good notes from the air and stringing them together is the same as pulling out the good points from within a person and stringing them together, one after the next after the next. And through that, what are you doing? You are making melodies. He says, this is the aspect of I will sing to God be'odi, with the little I have left. And I put that line from Psalms on the bottom of the slide there. Specifically, be'odi, by means of my ode, ode means more, that I find in myself, the aspect of in yet a little bit the wicked man is not, as explained above. By means of this point, I am able to sing and give praise to God, as explained above. That is, just as one finds the good points in oneself and finds another and another and another, this is the place from which one can overcome a state of gloom and depression and find ways to sing songs to God. But he says this is a skill. It's a skill that must be developed. It's not an easy skill. But some can do it. And someone who can make the aforementioned melodies, i.e., he's capable of judging all people favorably, even the rabble and the wicked, because he persistently searches and seeks to find the good points in all of them, through which melodies are made, as explained above. This tzaddik, this holy person, since he is on this level, is capable of being the cantor and messenger of the people, the person leading musically the services in the synagogue. That is, he can lead the communal prayers because he has within him this aspect, which is a necessary requirement to be a truly fitting messenger of the people, that is, a messenger of their prayers. For he must possess the aspect whereby all the good points are drawn to him and are merged within him, so that he is capable of gathering all the good points that are to be found in each Jew, even a Jewish sinner, as explained above. Rabbi Nachman is telling us that this action of finding the good points in every person, including oneself, and putting them together creates melody. The person who can see the good in every person is the one who is fit to be the cantor, the singer on behalf of the people in delivering their prayers. That person can truly be a messenger for the congregation. I asked a teacher in the Breslov community what it means for a person to make a melody in this way. His answer was incredible. He explained to me that his understanding of this is that what we know of as melody, is really just a glimpse of what a real melody is in the higher realm. All of creation is here to give us a sense of what's going on in the higher realm. And the best we can do to understand this concept of what real melody is to understand the concept of a melody in the physical sense, in which notes are strung together in a way that impacts us on the deepest level, as every music lover knows. What must it be then for the melody to be composed of the good points found in every person? To sum up, our exploration here has shown that in the minds of the Jewish mystics that we have explored today, music is a tool of connection to God. Examining these discourses reveals that music is understood to be imbued in its very essence with an ability to transcend the limits of the human realm. Through music, religious aspirations are actualized in tangible ways. To close, I'd like to share with you one final melody, this one associated with Rabbi Nachman. laugh by accident. I apologize. Anyway, thank you very much for being here this evening. If anybody has any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm sure there are questions from the audience, and I will get to them.
I'm really curious, did any of our more familiar Czech composers like Dvořák or Smetana ever use any music like this?
It's a great question, not to my knowledge, no. I will say in literature, we have some allusions. For example, Kafka was very interested in Jewish stories, but I don't know of that emerging in the Czech composers in particular. Not to my knowledge is the best answer I can give right now.
Have you heard Iva Bytová recently singing? She's a Czech. Does new music, and so much. There seems to be an influence there in
Fantastic.
my ears.
Okay, great.
Well, I just spent Simchas Torah in Borough Park, and I agree that music for them is very important. During the Hakofas, they have a lot of singing, they have a lot of dancing, a lot of jumping up and down, and so forth. I found a Zemer for Simchas Torah recently, and it turned out that it's in Aramaic. And I'm wondering what the role of Aramaic was for the Hasidim. It seems like to me, it seems like they were favored Aramaic sometimes over Hebrew.
It's a great question. Well, certainly Aramaic is part of the education because of the study of Talmud. So that's the first thing to say. So everybody who grows up in the Hasidic world can read Aramaic more or less fluently. In Hasidic songs, it's a little less common. However, if you go back farther in the Kabbalistic tradition to the Ari, for example, Rabbi Isaac Luria, he wrote in Aramaic. So you do have songs from him, specifically Shabbat songs from him, that are in Aramaic. Hasidic songs, less common. Occasionally you will find songs that are, this is also relatively uncommon, but you will find songs that are, for example, in Hungarian and local languages like that. But generally, the songs that do have words, many songs do not have words, those that do have words are usually taken from psukim, from verses in Tanakh. So Aramaic is less common, but it does pop up from time to time if they want to quote from the Talmud especially.
Hasidic groups in Eastern Europe were spread rather widely, broadly.
Yes.
Are there some differences between, let's say, Hasidim in former Ukraine, Mukachevo, and these areas, versus those around Prague, around Hungarian cities, in the music, in the mysticism, etc., if there are differences?
So around you're asking specifically around the Czech lands, or you're asking around Europe more widely? I see. Yeah. That's true. Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying. So first of all, I would point people to a fantastic book called The Atlas of Hasidism, which has maps that map where the Hasidic dynasties were all around Europe, and you can see in different eras where people were. And it shows those that went into the Czech lands, which were mostly to the eastern portion of the Czech lands. What I would say is that many of them were actually doubling down on the strictness of their religious discipline because they were reacting to the reform movement that was happening, particularly in Germany, and because of the Pressburg Yeshiva and then its legacy continuing forward, many of the groups there and in Hungary really became very staunch opponents to reform, and therefore they really doubled down on their observance. Groups in other places all developed different customs, different outlooks towards the wider world. For example, Chabad, which was primarily a Russian Hasidic dynasty, had a different approach to how to deal with the wider world than many of the other groups as well. So it would take a little bit more research to find if we can identify a distinct difference between those in the Czech lands and elsewhere. But off the top of my head, I think the opposition to reform because of proximity was an important one.
My question is comparing music with lyrics taken from the scriptures versus the music without any. And I'd like your thoughts from your knowledge. I find the ones with text to be much more stimulating. When I listen to a song without the lyrics, I simply also have a religious experience, but I'm remembering the people from my childhood who sang those songs, old Eastern European Jews, those who never knew the Breslover himself, Rav Nachman Breslov. What is it evoking for them, and what are your thoughts?
It's a great question. So I have a bit of a theory on this, which I got from Rabbi Shenker, who I'm writing about, who is a big expert in nigunim, probably the world's greatest expert on nigunim during his lifetime. He told me something very interesting. He was of the opinion that really it was a much later innovation for the music to have any words. Historically, he said, all of the old nigunim that you find do not have words at all. It was an innovation of, drawing a blank at just this moment, just had it. The person who started the Daf Yomi cycle, whose name I'm blanking on right now, big Rosh Yeshiva. It'll come to me as soon as we finish, I'm sure. I'll look it up. Yeah. Exactly. The Lubliner Rosh Yeshiva. Yes. Anyway, he was a composer, and it's believed that he composed some of the first songs that had words to them. And based on that, that practice took off, and many others, including in Mudgett, started to compose with words. So the older practice was to not have words. And the idea, as I understand it, was that to connect to an infinite God, it's better to have meaningless sounds. It's not that they're meaningless, it's that they're unlimited sounds. And through that, you can connect to that which is unlimited. Meir Shapiro. Rabbi Meir Shapiro is the name. That's right. Yes.
Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more about how some of these figures did or did not connect to the musical soundscape around themselves. I mean, because some of them, for example, the Chatham Sofer that you discussed, he had, one could say, I mean, he not only was, of course, as you say, a defender of tradition against what he saw as the assault of reform, he also had the mistaken notion that the challenge of modernity was a temporary event that he could defeat once and for all, and then modernity would recede, and you could go back to things as they had always been. That it was that was part of why you needed to make no compromises with modernity, because it was a temporary, so to speak, brought in by Napoleon and will go out with him as well. So did all of these attitudes affect their relationships to the soundscape that they grew up in, that they heard, that they interacted with, and so on? Could you expand on that relation perhaps a little?
So there's a few things to say there. Firstly, I would refer you to that article that I mentioned by a contemporary Schreiber that argues that the understanding that The Chassam Sofer was completely opposed to the secular knowledge that was, was cultivated through the Enlightenment. That's actually not what happened. And he does this by analyzing his writings and by writing the writings of those who were in his inner circle. And it's very interesting because he shows that actually he was more open than many of us think to these sorts of adaptations, but he felt the need at this particular time to put up some walls to protect the yeshiva and its community. And it's undeniable that many of the songs that we have from these, certainly the early Hasidic groups, although the Chassam Sofer was not himself Hasidic, but they certainly sound a lot like the folk music of the neighboring communities. And this can't be an accident. Clearly, they were picking up songs from their neighbors. And this makes sense. They were in the marketplace together. They were interacting with non-Jews regularly. So the soundscape was what it was, and people picked up these melodies. How it was directed was what was important, I think. Now, it's interesting. In Chabad in particular, they have a whole discourse that they call musical teshuvah, or musical tikkun. And the idea is that there's actually a four-step process by which a melody from a non-Jewish and therefore not sufficiently holy environment could be co-opted and brought into their canon itself. And so there's actually a discourse about this that when I see it, what I see is a religious justification for adopting the melodies that are taken from outside of the community and bringing them into the community. So all of that shows us that really there was a lot of musical interaction going on. Inevitably, yes, as there always is. And I think that it's not a reason to, sometimes people think that that's a reason to think that the music is less pure or something like that. But this is the way that musical exchange always happens. So that's, I think, the best answer I can give at this moment. Yeah. Napoleon's March. What's that? Napoleon's March, yes. That's a good example of it, yes. And they have others as well. Shamil's Nigun is a good example.
In Chabad, they finish the Yom Kippur services with singing the Napoleon's March.
That's right, yes. Yes.
Is there any similarity between the role of music in Jewish mysticism and Sufism in Islam?
It's a great question. The question was, are there any similarities between Jewish mysticism and Sufism? What I can say is this. If we go back farther, there certainly were interactions in the time of the Rambam. The Rambam's son, Maimonides' son, actually had a concerted effort to combine the Jewish mysticism that he was familiar with Sufism. It was a very deliberate attempt to try to bring those two worlds together. As we get further into history, the Hasidic movement is not going to necessarily have as many interactions with Sufis. Geographically, it wouldn't have made sense that they would have so many interactions. But I think that if you look at the world of Kabbalah among the Sephardim, you might find some more, my guess is that you're going to find some more similarities there, but I don't know for certain. What I can tell you is that there were writings on this by the son of the Rambam, who was really very consciously trying to make those two things go together.
So I have a question. If we go to times earlier than the Hasids, I mean, there were other mystics who traveled through the Czech lands, the Sabbateans, the Franks. Did they also have any special music that you know of, or that one knows of?
It's a great question. The answer is, I'm sure they do, and I don't know any of their songs.
I'm curious about the melodies that are revealed by analyzing the good points of someone. Is that a melody that is supposedly residing within the person a priori, and the person who's doing the searching discovers the musical essence of the other person, or is it something that the searcher is attributing to the person?
My understanding is that the searcher is finding one note after another note after another note within that person, and is finding that person's, extracting that person's melody and bringing that into the fore, to the extent that it actually fundamentally changes the spiritual standing of that individual, because now those things are in the foreground and the other things are extracted. So I think it's an act of finding it there. But Rabbi Nachman's whole point here is that it's not just about finding in the other people, it's also about discovering within oneself.
That's why I was asking.
I think that he would probably say, and I'm surmising here, that the act of doing this spiritual work on oneself makes you then more capable of finding the good points in others, certainly, yeah.
More questions?
Do you know if there were any Jewish communities, Ashkenazi or not, that viewed music negatively, like the way traditionally Islam prohibits music?
It's a great question. The answer has to be a little bit nuanced. The idea is this: after the destruction of the temple, there was an idea that instrumental music should be banned, because this was too much of rejoicing. And we were now in a sad state. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, how could one play a musical instrument at that point? So there were major debates over whether there should be music should be allowed at all. And there are some communities that in Jerusalem will not actually play musical instruments as deference to this opinion. So the reintroduction of music on that level was controversial, of musical instruments. But today, outside of that one element having to do with Jerusalem, music is very much embraced. What I will say is that there's perhaps people are familiar with this, there's an idea of whether or not musical instruments are permitted on Shabbat, on Saturday, that Orthodox communities will not permit. But music as a whole, that would be the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head to point to.
To what extent did the music of the mystics come from the synagogue nusach, or from the folk music of the country in which they lived?
It's a combination of the two, really. As I mentioned before, the music of the local communities very much impacted the soundscape of the Hasidic community, certainly, but also the way that it was sung was very much based on the cantorial traditions, right? Vocal embellishments like krechts and things like this are part of the singing of these songs, which really comes out of the synagogue soundscape. Right. Well, each Hasidic court had its own musical repertoire, and does to this day. A lot of them sound quite similar to each other, but if you go a bit further afield, right, with not neighboring communities, but communities, for example, if you compare the Polish Hasidim, who have songs that sound a lot like the polka music that was popular at the time, to the Russian Hasidic communities that have the songs that sound a lot like the Russian military bands, that would be some noticeable differences at that point. And people who are kind of accustomed to the soundscapes of Hasidic music will easily point out to you, oh, that sounds like it must be a Russian Hasidus, that must be a Chabad tune, or that sounds Polish, that sounds Hungarian, whatever it is.
Just a note, in Italy, the Jewish community, they play organ until a few years ago, when the Israeli rabbinate overcome they claim that they've been in Rome even before the destruction of the temple.
Thank you. Yeah, the Italian community is a fascinating one. Since we mentioned, yes, played by a non-Jew on the holiday, right? It's because we mentioned the organ. I'll just tell you the side that I skipped over accidentally before and said we'd come back to. In Prague, because we were talking about the Maharal, in Prague, in one of the synagogues, they put in an organ. This is in the late 1500s, and it was played by non-Jews. The rule was that it had to stop. They had to stop playing it half an hour before Shabbat started, and it was permitted in that area. But one of the reasons for that, A.Z. Edelson, one of the important early Jewish ethnomusicologists, gives for the installation of the organ, he says there are two reasons. One was because they wanted to sound like the local non-Jewish communities, the Protestant communities that were that had a lot of this music. But also the other was that Lurianic Kabbalah had come into Prague at this time, and the Kabbalah really emphasized bringing in Shabbat with song, and so that was one of the reasons why they justified having the organ there at all.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending. I hope you'll come to our others. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.